Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It's so exciting to see everyone. This is our first live stream, and we're really excited that all of you have joined us. My name is Adora Fisher, and I'm the Director of the Education Preparation Programs at the Santa Clara County Office of Education. And our department provides credentialing for teachers who are interested in becoming special education teachers. And we also provide credentialing for teachers who are interested in becoming site administrators. The focus of all of our programs are equity, social justice, and inclusion. And all of our programs have a thread of equity that runs through the curriculum, and social justice as well as inclusion. We have created equity principles for all of our programs, and we abide by those equity principles in our program. So this whole conversation that we're going to have today is really near and dear to my heart. And in our education preparation programs, we've worked really hard to ensure that equity was a focus. And we continue to do so. We continue to reiterate equity and social justice throughout the programs every year. We were really excited when Enid Lee chose to grace us with her knowledge and experiences in our program. And agreed to teach one of our courses. In addition to that, Enid has done other work in the program with us as well. And I cannot speak highly enough of her and her contributions to anti-racism work. She's a fascinating person. Her experiences are vast and her knowledge is unbelievable. And as you listen to our conversation today, we're going to stop every now and then to invite you to join in the conversation and have an exchange with Enid. And we also will put her website into the chat. So I would like to take a moment just to allow Enid to introduce herself and to tell us a little bit about her background. Enid?
Thank you very much, Adora, for inviting me to have this conversation with you, and also for inviting me to introduce myself. That can be a dangerous thing, but I will try to be brief and spread my introductions throughout what I have to say, because really thinking about introducing myself is really introducing many of the fellow travelers I've had on this anti-racist journey for the past 35 years or so. And 35 years to get it into a 5-minute introduction could be a little tight, but I'll get started. And I want to say hello to everybody. I see lots of friendly faces out there, people who have been part of the journey. And I'm glad you're here. And I'm also happy to see new people. So I'll start this part of it by saying that I began my journey, and really what was has been a joyful journey as an educator about 5 decades ago on the island of Antigua in the Caribbean, where I spent my formative years. And if I want to be truthful, I should say I started it a little bit earlier when I played school with my sister and brother, Robin and Irvin, and I think they said they were coming, but who knows what they do to their sister in the last minute, as we played school in Montserrat, in the house of 2 educators, Alfred and Eva Lee. And we were nurtured by a whole range of godparents who were themselves educators. So that's where all of this got started. And then I'm going to jump very quickly to Canada, which is where my anti-racist work specifically began when I was a student there. Today, I would describe myself as an anti-racist professional development specialist, a leadership coach, a writer, and a community builder. And I've had the opportunity to consult internationally. And in that work, I've had as my goal supporting educators to prepare young people for creating a world that is more just, more joyful, and more generous than it is at present. Some of those educators are in this room, and I'll be showing you some pieces of lives we have shared together. But in Canada, I had a chance to start that work in 1985, when I became the first race relations supervisor in a district. Canada has these particular special categories. A race relations supervisor is a person who is responsible in a district for implementing the race and ethnic relations policy. And that was the job I started with, which got me on this path. And in that process, I have had a chance to work with some people who are here, a good colleague and friend of mine, Marcella Duran, who said she was showing up. I can't see everybody, but I'm making sure that I name people who told me they were coming. And of course, if they haven't come, then there will be a reckoning. But so Marcella should be here. She was one of the people who worked closely with. Then I traveled across and worked across Canada in 5 provinces, from Nova Scotia to British Columbia, and with big stops in Manitoba, Winnipeg, Manitoba, with Suni Matthews, again, who said she'd be coming. And all of those places helped me to understand that anti-racist education was an applied field and that it could be implemented in any context in education. Skipping over from Canada, let me talk about how my work slipped into the United States in cities like Cambridge, Massachusetts, and where I met Dr. Linda Mizell, who worked on my PowerPoint presentation, who was part of the Enid Lee Equity Institute for 12 years and continued to be my friend. And I see Victor Bradley, who was with us too. So the family is definitely here. And so that work in Cambridge, Massachusetts got me into the United States somewhat. And I'll get quicker and speed it up because I know we don't have all day and we have a lot of questions and things, but I have to tell you how the work has moved across the country. And from that time in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I began to work with folks in Washington, DC, where I've done 3 major projects: in Teaching for Change and the National Coalition of Education Activists, very much a part of the work having to do with Beyond Heroes and Holidays, that book which many of you know. And that work led me to work with the DC Writing Project with the Washington Teachers Union. And Elizabeth Davis, the president, she's been big in this. I'm naming names because nobody does anti-racist work by themselves. And if you're doing it by yourself, you're probably not doing it correctly, if you know what I mean. It's got to be collaborative and grounded and connected to other people's realities. And you have to have people who challenge you and push you and urge you to do better. So that was that. And then I got invited by Professor James Banks and his wife to attend a conference in Washington State. I was asked to speak for 20 minutes about prejudice reduction. I didn't know what it was that I could say in 20 minutes, but I went. And that talk led me to 3 years consulting work from Alaska to Winnipeg, to Alaska to Minnesota, to Milwaukee, and so forth. And I think that the only reason why I was invited was that what I said seemed to have connected with school practice, and that deepened my understanding further that this had to do with what everybody's concerned with. So that got me all over the United States, Alaska, Tennessee, all over, and I learned a great deal. Another day of talking in Washington, D.C., I got asked by a professor at California State Long Beach, UC Long Beach. He said to me, would you come out and help us in California to work on a project with immigrant students? He was the head, Dr. David Ramirez. He said, we have this Center for Language Minority Education and Research, and we could use an anti-racist focus in the work. So I said, when do you want me to come? He said, like, how about next week? That seemed a little hasty, but I did pack up and find myself out here. And then the last 25 years, I've done a great deal of work in the state of California, from the CABE, California Association of Bilingual Education, the work with Adora, the work with Dr. Noni Reese, who is here when she was principal of the Starlight Elementary School, was a professional development school, and then a former principal of Santa Cruz High School, retired principal Karen Edmonds. I am naming names because anti-racist work does not happen in a vacuum. You don't get to do that work unless people allow you to come into their schools and their districts and their universities, and they give institutional support so you can do it. So that's why these people are being called out in this fashion. I will stop very soon, but I want to say one more thing. COVID has led me to another place. Before COVID, the center, the new teacher center invited me after I'd been in Long Beach to come to Santa Cruz, where I worked as a visiting scholar with teachers who were going in to support new teachers. And Trinidad Castro, who was one of my colleagues in that and has continued to work, he should be here. And that led to a great deal of work with teachers, with administrators, and across the state of California. I was to stay about I think maybe 2-3 years, but 25 years later, I'm still in California. So you can see I clearly love this place. Fires notwithstanding, earthquakes notwithstanding, I'm here. And there are a number of schools across this state. I would say about 22 districts I've worked in this state, and had a hands-on experience with people in their classrooms, in their principal's offices and so forth. And just talking about this makes me realize how worthwhile it has all been. And to say, in the face of such rabid racism, we can take courage because this work can be done. The last person I want to mention is my co-host, Reginald Hall, who has helped me since COVID to transform what I do in a day into an 1.5 hour long webinar. And he has helped me to use the tools to share use the tools of technology to share what I've done across the country and back east. So yes, Adora, you asked me to introduce myself. It probably was a little longer than you expected, but I had to do this because I want to make the case that nobody, especially not this woman, gets anywhere doing this work without a whole lot of people being part of it. And one of the things that makes you confident is that if you work with other people, it means that when you're not doing that work yourself, when they've asked you to leave, when they've cut the budget, you know the work will go on because the seeds have been sown. So thank you for indulging me, and welcome to everybody who's here, people who haven't seen in years. So glad to see you, and all the new faces I'm looking forward to. And I'm ready to talk and to listen. Okay. So that's it, Adora. Maybe you won't ask.
And you were so shy about introducing yourself when we talked about this.
That seems a little, interesting. But I was glad to do it because it made me think about all of these people.
Okay, wonderful.
I'll see you. Thank you. Okay.
So the first question I really want to start with is for you to talk about a little bit about why you do this work and what drives you when you get up in the morning. Considering all that we're dealing with in terms of racism in this country now and equity, what drives you to get up and face that work every day, especially since you've been doing it for 35 years? And here we are, and the work still exists.
Yes, yes. Let me say a few quick things about that. Part of what makes me able to do it is that I have been doing it for a long time in many different settings. So that has given me a grounding. And also because I've done it with a whole lot of people who are still working on it and also bringing new folks on. So that's a piece of it. But I would say it goes back even a bit further. I had a very joyful childhood. And so in some ways, when I think about schools, I want that experience for every student. And I know that there are systems within our school that can contribute to life and learning being joyful, and that there's some that won't. In fact, some work directly against that, marginalized students, limiting them, and really racism sets in and we see how hard it is to do that. So I want that to happen for every student. And then I look back even a little further. The roots that I come from, both communally and in terms of the fact that I'm a Black woman living at these times, and I look at the history and the wealth and the lessons from the continent of Africa, it gives me courage. It says, you can't turn back now, and there is reason to be hopeful. I guess the third piece has to do with the studying I've done around it. Racism is systemic. Therefore, I don't expect it to go away overnight. I know from both study and work that you work to dismantle the systems, and you also know how easy it is for those systems to reintegrate themselves because they serve an interest. So I'm ready for it. I have a slogan that says, expect racism, do not accept it. So, from there, that's where I'm coming from in terms of observation. And specifically, what do I do every morning? I get awake at 5 o'clock in time to listen to Democracy Now! Some of you may know Democracy Now!, some of you may not, but I listen to that because I hear the examples of systemic racism in action. But I also hear the resistance to racism. And I literally I have a book that I list the systemic racism in education, in policing, in housing. And then I also listen to all the organized efforts of human beings to counteract that. And when I have those two things together, I'm ready to roll. Long answer, but that's how I do it. And as long as I am able, I will be doing it, and I'm encouraging others to do it.
You talk about, you just mentioned racism is systemic.
Yes.
And you made that statement as if there was no question that racism is systemic.
Yes.
And in our country today and in our context, we have people who don't believe racism is systemic. Yes. They believe that there is racism, but that it's not systemic necessarily. So could you expand on why you made that statement so strongly, as if there is no question that it is systemic?
Well, yeah, I would say when people challenge that, and it often is challenged because we have learned to think of racism as an episode, happening now and then. However, when you examine the relationships between institutions and pieces of institutions, even in our practices in schools, we see that they form a system. There are a set of procedures that work together that provide an outcome. And that's what I mean by systemic. It's deep, it's historic, in the laws of the country, in the institutions we have set up. And facing that it's systemic makes you able to address it at a systemic level. I like to think of systems also like how we think of systems in our body, the digestive system and other things. They work together. And if you bear in mind they work together, then you are able to see how housing impacts schooling, how teacher preparation impacts assessments and discipline, and so forth in our schools. So and I try to show it. And one of the things I do is work on systems in our classroom, because we are not being taught to think about things as systems. We are taught to think about things as episodes every now and then. Like, for instance, the concept of the word anti-racism, it used to cause great distress because people would say, well, why are you talking about what you're against, what's anti? And then I would say, think of it. The opposite to anti-racist is what? Racist, right? So recognizing that the system is racist, when you work consciously to dismantle it, you're doing a good thing. You're doing a good thing. And so that's how I've tried to do it and help people to see the systems themselves. It also means that I don't get defeated and say nothing has changed, right? Because a lot of times when I work in schools, when racism shows its head again, people say, you see, we did all this training and nothing has changed. No, some things have changed because of the work we have done. However, some things have been changed back because of the work others have done, you know, and we have to be constantly monitoring it. That's why I take it as an approach. It's a hopeful approach, actually.
And so what I'm hearing you say, though, is that anti-racist work is not a straight trajectory. Absolutely. That you're going to move forward and back and forward and back. But at the same time, in my growing up in this country, and not that I'm from anywhere else, but as I look back on my experiences and my life, there have been periods in the country where anti-racism, equity, the conversations have disappeared. Yes. There are huge gaps and times when no one's speaking about it. And so, so what do you mean when you say that you have to keep working at it? What does that mean? And what happens when we leave those gaps where it's not addressed?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that happens with people not speaking about it, we go through eras when things have improved considerably and we think, oh, we don't have to address it. For instance, we went through that post-racial piece, remember? After President Obama's election, people thought, oh, it's all settled. Far from it. Certainly things had been accomplished, but it wasn't all settled. Many institutions still had racist tendencies at their roots and so forth. The other thing to say is that once everyone has not been touched, everyone is not included in this conversation, then we have work to do. You know, like some people, it has improved with them, and other people, it hasn't. So for instance, the new faces of racism, the new faces that appear around Islamophobia, which has racist, you know, when people engage in Islamophobic behavior, it really has racist roots to it. Also, you know, unless we keep addressing the newest forms of this disenfranchisement along the lines of race, then we have the work to do. You know, and what I find is, don't sort of argue with people about, but say, let's take a look at what's happening. Let's take a look at what's happening. The other thing is that some people get insecure when their centrality as maybe white people gets displaced, you know? And so they think, oh, we can't go any further with this. We have done a lot, right? But again, we have to look, we have to keep examining who is included, who is limited, whose life is diminished in this process. So by pointing to specific examples in terms of their scope and their depth and their historic relevance, that's how you do it.
You know, I was in another meeting prior to coming to our live stream today, yes. And there was a term that was used, and it was used in relation to trauma and racism. And the term was generational trauma. And that ethnicities and races who have experienced generational trauma have never had an opportunity to heal. And so that trauma is passed on from one generation to another. And I'd like to know your thoughts about racism and anti-racism work in relation to generational trauma, which we are seeing in our classrooms today. As a African-American woman and growing up, I do remember my own parents and grandparents and extended family telling stories and behaving in certain ways that I then passed on to my children. And in retrospect, I look at it and think, wow, I am passing on to them a history that, or a story that I don't know that I want them to carry. And then they carry that story into the classroom with them. Yeah. And their teachers respond to it in certain ways.
Yes.
Could you speak to what that really means?
Yeah. Let me briefly give an example of how I think that storytelling, that an opportunity to recount that story, needs to be part of curriculum, needs to be part of what we address teaching and learning, right? Needs to be part of what we have in mind when we're thinking about school-family relationships, when we're trying to engage with people who don't trust the school, or say in questions of discipline where people are automatically feeling unfairly treated, because that's what the history has been. So I think surfacing those stories is important, and not just dismissing them as people having chips on their shoulder, which is how they sometimes get described. But when we're able to surface them, when we're able to take those things into account, teaching and learning, we have a chance for healing, but there must be room for that. I think that's what professional development should include when we do our work. And so, for instance, there are schools I've worked in where they're doing trauma-related professional development. And people sometimes think they have to choose between doing the trauma-related professional development or the anti-racist, professional development. And I'm suggesting that anti-racism needs to be embedded in the trauma-related professional development, and also embedded in the, the mindfulness training. Like often principals say to me, Enid, we have to choose between equity, anti-racism, you, and the mindfulness people. We have to juggle. It's a checklist, or sometimes they say we have to choose you and literacy or whatever. And that is why I make the strong case. This is an applied field. You can do whatever you are planning to do and make sure you do it through an anti-racist lens. I'd be more than happy to help you with that. So yes, I think that's how you get at it.
So can you give an example of what you mean by applied field?
Yes, so there is, maybe a good one is math, because a lot of the math department, a lot of schools I've worked in, the math department, they kind of think, well, what is this anti-racism got to do with math? I mean, math is math, right? It's pure. Well, of course it's not. It's social, and it has to do with both how it's taught, who we believe can learn it, So by applied, I mean, it's applied to areas like content, assessment, expectations, climate, funding, professional development, supervision, and an assessment of teachers. So everything that you can think of in a school, you can put it through the anti-racist lens and ask, how is this being done? Who is impacted favorably or not by it? That's really the question. Who is benefiting from the way we're doing this? Who is excluded? And that's always been the approach I take. I've never gone into school and brought up the anti-racist question. I would say, so what are you working on today? Whatever it is. And they will say literacy or family relations. And I'd say, let's ask some questions about how people are being impacted, who is disenfranchised and so forth. And that's what I mean, it's applied. I have never had anyone say to me, well, why are you talking with me about this? What has this got to do with why I'm hired here? Because it has to do with why you're hired here and why and what it is you want to achieve, right? I don't know any educator who goes to work in order to discriminate against students. They may have it in mind, but I have never met them. So I'm assuming that they want all to be part of it, and they want all students to succeed. And so that's why I say it's applied. But maybe we should hear from what others want to say, to challenge, to experience. But those are the answers I have for the questions that, come up about what is this work? You're dismantling systems that limit human beings on the basis of their skin color, as we call race, or any of the indicators that are connected with race. So for instance, we have placeholders like neighborhood and nation and so forth. Like we say, it's a rough neighborhood, but we know who we're talking about there, So we want to strip those out and get down to who are we talking about and what we can do differently.
All right, let's open it up to the audience and take some questions from the audience.
So I have a question from Crystal here, and she is asking you, Enid, what are some good tips for bringing people into the conversation who have not been and/or avoided?
Okay.
So I'm going to unmute. I may ask Crystal. Is that Crystal Adams who asked?
I can unmute her. Yeah.
Okay,
I can
great.
unmute.
And so she can pose her question and follow up with Enid.
So should I respond, and then Crystal will Yeah. So Crystal, very briefly, the starting point to this discussion is always where people are currently standing. I know it is a cliche to say, you've got to begin with where people are. And you would think, well, where else could you begin? I mean, if you don't meet people where they are, you will be walking by yourself. You can do that if that's what turns you on. But the main thing is to meet people where they are. Like to say, so what have you been working on? What are you going to be working on? You know, things like that. So it's in their ballpark. And so I'm not putting my agenda. What would you like to see better happen in your school? What are the areas that you would like to be improved? You know, and you can even say many things are going well. What would you like to see better? For instance, I was in a school that is considered the highest performing middle school in a certain district. And you think, well, why are they asking me to come in here? And they said, even though we're the highest performing district, there's a gap in the performance between African-American, Latino students and white and Asian students. So I've acknowledged that many things are going well, but that isn't so. Short answer. They ask people what's on their mind, what they would like to see happen better. And a good question is, what have you tried so far with it? You know, to assume that something happened. Is Crystal, where's Crystal? Can she?
I'm right here.
Where is she? Yeah. Do you have more, does that make sense? Oh, Crystal, there she is. So any thoughts? Does that make sense? What happens when you do that?
I think that's kind of true with anything. I think sometimes the anti-racist conversations and equity-based conversations have a different emotional layer on them than some other things that we discuss as school leaders. And so just ways to meet people where they are while keeping those layers in mind and being respectful of them, I think is sometimes a challenge.
Yes, I would say that many of the things that we know to meet people, we abandon them because this anti-racist thing is something so special, so unique, so obscure, you know, but I would say go for it. There was a group of people in Washington, D.C., actually at the National Museum of African American History and Culture when I gave a presentation there for teachers. And I said, I want you to think about how you would approach any other subject besides race and racism. What are the strategies you would use if that was considered a difficult subject, a difficult topic, but it was not race and racism? And everything that they came up with, those are the things that you would use. You know, we really have been almost traumatized to forget everything we know about it. And obviously the cost can be high, but that's where you get started. And the more you learn about the history and the manifestations of racism, it's the more confidence you get to try it. And also to think of why is this important? You know, so that's what I would do. That's what I've encouraged folks to do. And when people say they don't know what to do, I say, well, let's take a look at what you said you would do if it was, for instance, I'm thinking about something with gender or something with religion. Just let's try it. Let's try it. Others.
Let's take another question.
Yeah.
Joseph had a question. So Joseph, go ahead and ask a question.
Okay, great. Thank you. So you stated that systemic racism is a fact. How have you dealt with the politics of the educational system when this fact, and I agree it's a fact, is disputed by those in higher level and governmental leadership roles? How do you keep the politics out of anti-racism as much as possible, since as teachers we kind of have to be politically neutral?
I don't know about the political neutrality, but let me say this, that you know, we know that in a very real sense, nothing is neutral in education. Education is you're either working for something or against it. So that's how I would begin. I would begin the conversation of saying, you're either working to improve the condition, to change it, or you're maintaining it. And that we can see that in everyday practice. So I would use, you know what I do? I use the most everyday common sense words to make my point. And part of that comes from the background I have in social linguistics, which prepares you to understand effectively how to use language in a social context. So for instance, somebody lays something out saying whatever, and I don't tell them, no, that's wrong. I would say, what else might we consider, right? So I've left what they've said on the table, and I've pushed I've radicalized a little bit what they said by saying, what else, right? If you're being exclusionary in your language, and I listen to who you say is there and who created whatever, I would say, who else might we consider, you know? And I would do that with every level of education, because those are words that people can understand. They can understand how you expand the conversation. They can look at who's been omitted, right? And I would do that. And I think the most important thing is to keep looking at what people say are their goals. If you say you want all of the students to succeed, if you want everyone who works here to feel valued and so forth, all those good things. I've never come across a district where the word all is not in the mission statement. And once you point to that, it gets very hard to not talk about the racism, the sexism, the classism. That's part of it. So that's how I would do it. And the other thing, I don't have great expectations that once I start working with people, they would say, yes, Enid, that's the best idea since puffed wheat. No, not necessarily. In fact, I get a little worried if they do that. I like it when they push back and they say, yes, but what about, you know, because you know that the cognitive maps are working, right? And you shouldn't be afraid of being contradicted or argued with, you see? One of the lessons I learned early when my mother was trying to prevent me from falling into destruction as a person loving to speak and debate, she called me and she said to me, Enid, who do you think you are that you cannot be contradicted, right? And I was just 16, and I learned from that I could be contradicted. And I prepare myself for contradictions because maybe I'm getting someplace. That's what I would try.
So Enid, you have spent a long time in this work. And 35 years ago, you wrote a book, Letters to Marsha.
Right.
And Marsha was a teacher, and you spoke to Marsha in your book. And here we are 35 years later, and we have teachers in classrooms dealing with a lot of angst and situations around equity and racism.
Yes.
What would you say 35 years later if you were talking to Marsha today?
Well, I guess I would ask Marsha how things are actually going with her. Again, I would start with where she is, you know, give me examples where you think things are not going well or that you would like to see them improve. But basically, I would maneuver the conversation to where we think about systems, where we talk about history, where we talk about power, those features, right? And then where we talk about the steps that have to be put in place to make it different. But I would start with where she's at. A friend of mine just came in here, and I remember she used to say in Toronto, Marcella Durand, she would say, we have to engage in ceremonies of repetition, meaning that no year should pass, no new set of teachers should come in, no new set of administrators should start without addressing this issue. And we tend to treat the anti-racism a little bit like a checklist, you know? So we do it some years, but not, you know? We do include it some years, and that doesn't work. In the same way that you would not write math off the curriculum and say, oh, we've covered that. No, you've got to deal with this historic and present inequality, racist inequality and others every year. So I would say, let's get working on that. But I would begin with the fact it's systemic. And when she's feeling defeated, I would say, look, this is where we have come so far in terms of embracing languages, embracing differences of many kinds. And here is where we have to go yet. So that's how I would deal with it. And about Letters to Marsha, I was totally surprised. I wrote that book 35 years ago when I was 35 years old. And this year, a 35-year-old teacher read the book and told me she kept checking the front of it to see when I wrote it. So I'm thinking, well, there must be a lot there, and it deals with the things I'm talking about. And I asked her, well, what should I change in it? How could I improve it? And she said, you should just change a little bit of the language, you know, because we talk more about caregivers as opposed to just parents, you know. But she said basically you were dealing with the important things. And what's the basis of that book? It applies to everything that schools deal with. It focuses on the all. It deals with the power that you have as a teacher, as a department, as a school, as a district, as a community, as a nation, and as a world. And you engage it wherever you can. It is a very hopeful work in many ways, especially if you listen both for the resistance that people put forward to racism, you know? Expressions of resistance to me are hopeful signs as opposed to desperate ones.
Oh, and my goodness, we all think of resistance as a bad thing. I'm gonna turn to the audience now, and I'm gonna say to you, one of the things Enid just talked about with Marsha was the things that were coming up for her and addressing those things in the book. I'm wondering what's coming up for you, and if you were to go to Enid and have a conversation with her about anti-racist work, what would you want to talk about? What would be coming up for you in your current context? So let's open the floor up for that conversation.
No one wants to talk to me. I can't believe it. My goodness. Since when has shyness set in? Hardly.
I think we've got some statements and questions in the chat.
Yeah. So someone's going to read it? You know, do I just read what's there?
Yeah, Enid, you can read it. And, you know, Maria, you can unmute yourself and you can offer
Maria.
your comment as well.
Yes. So Maria is saying, I love every teacher, admin. I love every teacher. Admin needs to do this work when they come on board as a part of the program. I think.
So Maria, do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. I think I'm cutting in front of Shawnee, my colleague Shawnee from our Equity Task Force team from Homestead High School.
We'll go back to Shawnee, so you can start.
So as we're working on starting our discussions at our schools,
Okay, Maria, you are cutting in and out on us. So I'm
maybe Shawnee go first. Almost.
Yeah, I'm going to go to Shawnee. So Shawnee, you can unmute yourself and then pose your statement and question. Is Shawnee still on?
She's here. She's having difficulty. Okay, good. She's unmuted.
Okay, good.
Hi, Enid. Thank you so much for doing this. I worked with you 20 years ago at Gilroy High School with Wendy Gudalowitz, and I remember there was pushback and resistance, and I was just a newbie teacher, so I just shut my mouth and just sparkled at you, hoping you would understand that I cared so deeply. But you remained so calm in the face of that resistance, and you touched a little bit on it now, but I feel that whenever I'm doing the work in the Equity Task Force or I'm leading a group of educators and I get that resistance, I get such a flood of emotions that I have a hard time remaining calm. So how do you do that? How do you remain so calm when you get this resistance?
If you remember what you are doing, if you remember what you're working for, you know, what you want to achieve, if you remember also that you are disrupting the status quo, right? So in some ways, you shouldn't be too surprised if people think, oh, this is not the grand party I thought it was going to be. You are actually shaking at the roots of things. And it's interesting you mentioned Gilroy, because in preparing for this, I found an overhead, you know, in those days before we had the fancy things, this was on an overhead projector. And I had forgotten my equity overhead on my overhead, which had the word equity on the computer, on the top of the thing. And I came back to the school and someone had written across it, Stalin couldn't have said this better, nothing but forced communism. and it was stuck over the photocopying machine, you know, and that's kind of a heavy charge, right? You could be accused of all, you could be thrown out of the country, you could be whatever. But in a way, I took that as a feedback on how it had resonated with some individuals. And so I worked that into what I was saying next time, not naming the person, but saying, let's really look and see if this call for equality, of valuing each person at the highest possible level, of confirming the humanness and worth of every person, because racism doesn't allow you to do that. Sexism doesn't allow you to do that. If that's what we're doing, isn't that something you are for, right? That's how I put it. I remember specifically. No one, it was a rhetorical question. I didn't get any answers, but I'm saying that you can use these things, you know, as a way of going deeper, because people are giving you feedback of how they're understanding it, you know? And sometimes people feel they need a moment to adjust to what you're saying, right? I remember doing some work in Canada and someone said, you know, when you talk about including everyone, this just feels like I'm not as Canadian as I thought I was before, you know, as a white person. And the other people in the group started to harass her and saying, how can you say that? I said, give her a moment. She needs a moment of adjustment to understand that there are other people in this community, in this world, and that her place is not, she's not been thrown out of the circle. She just has a different place in it, you know? So you really have to take that approach. Now, and you would say, but why? Because racism is learned. And if we are teaching, we have to employ the best things we know about teaching and learning, right? Like drawing from where people are, scaffolding, which is what good teaching is about, and keeping your vision on what we are going for. And as you slip back, I always say there's room for slippage. Slippage can be expected, right? But when you slip, you're held up because there's too much at stake to not continue. And someone has just written here this my friend Linda Mizell says, to Joseph's question, let's remember that African-American educators were among both the leaders and the foot soldiers of every movement for freedom. She asked you to check out, among others, Vanessa Siddle Walker's The Lost Education of Horace Tate, Uncovering the Hidden Heroes Who Fought for Justice in Schools, and Paul Ortiz's book, and so forth, right? So you're both in the moment. You have people behind you and you have those ahead of you who you're working on behalf of. Plus you have people right beside you who you can check out and support. And I don't want to make it sound like it's easy, but it's actually made more difficult by not looking at both history and the here and now, and also the things we know already.
So Enid, we have a question from someone on Facebook.
Yes, oh yes.
Okay,
Good.
so Enid, I'm just going to read aloud what their question is.
Yes.
It says, Enid mentioned the need to meet others and start where they are. How can we reach those who believe they are not racist and are doing a great job, some liberal white women, for example, and help them see how they are perpetuating harm?
Okay, so again, if you think you are doing a great job, let's look at that great job. You know, again, starting with where you're at. And then words like, who else? What else might we consider in addition to this, you know, to what else is happening there? Just open up the word or, break it out and ask, you know, even though you seem to have included everyone, even though everyone seems to be, you know, fine with this, how do you know? Let's dig deeper. Let's look at the ranking that we have of people. So I would say, let's start with what people say they are doing and broaden the discussion and radicalize it. And by radicalize it, I say, let's get to the root of what actually is going on here so that it won't keep reoccurring. And people get defensive if you say that, you know, if you suggest they're racist. But part of it is that the association with the word racism is that it is this terrible thing that only certain people engage in. And that is actually not an accurate rendering of the word. we live in a racist society. So how do you think that you can live in a racist society and not be infected by racism? It's like you live in a polluted society, right? How do you think you can escape your hair not getting dirty and dirt onto your fingernails? Like, how would that be possible, right? So let's look at the structural and systemic nature of it and get on with it. And the other thing too is that sometimes we get thrown off because people start crying when we talk about racism. Tears are good things. Tears are good things. I always have a box of Kleenex when I'm doing my workshops, right? Because it sometimes shows that movement is happening. I've been hauled in front of many superintendents for upsetting administrators. And I'm delighted when they call me in, because when they tell me that the principals are upset because of the workshops, I say that is wonderful. That shows that we are not wasting time. That shows that we are not wasting district funds on nonsense. We are getting at the root of things. And now we're going to take it further and link it always to what they say the district is about. If you keep the virtues of a society or whatever in front of you, let's keep talking about how that is the case or not, you know? So yeah, that's what I would say to those folks who, you know, think that they're doing a good job. Yes, you may be, but there is more to be done, right? And how do you know that it in fact is affecting everybody positively? I sometimes go to schools and the things that different groups of people say in the school, I have to wonder if they're working in the same school. People have such a different experience of the same climate and context, depending on their race, on their status, on their class, on their language. So I say, let's break it out and see if everybody thinks it's so grand. And in this day and age, when truth is evading us night and day, when the hardest thing to do is keep your mind on what is really going on, I would say, as an educator, you want to be able to see that what you're saying is true. You know? You want to be able to check it. Yeah.
So Enid, I want to go back to Maria, and then Krista Lemons also has a comment. Maria, are you?
I'm finally home. Thank you. I didn't want to miss on the conversation, so I was with my phone trying to listen in, and so I see a lot of team members taking notes, because we have a lot of Homestead Equity Task Force team members here, and it makes me incredibly proud because we've been trying to navigate through our staff and trying to provide good training. So Adora, please have these sessions because we need more guidance, we need more training, and we're here to learn so that we could do a good job for our kids.
And Maria, can I ask you to do something? Could you send me a copy of the notes people take? Anybody, because that's how I know what I've said is understood and how it's understood. Yeah, people who have been with me, I always run around at the end and say, could you send me a copy of your notes? Because, and it's not that I'm spying on them to see if they were doing shopping lists or something like that. When I see what people write down, I know what they have, what I've communicated, you know? So, okay, so you tell me, what is it you're thinking?
I really loved your point about every new team member that joins our school site needs to go through this work. And I think that's something that we need to keep going, keep doing and enforcing, because we want to make sure that they're there for the right purpose to fit the new culture of our school that we're creating. And we want to make sure that if they don't have this tools, that we then train them and support them to help us create a nurturing environment for all of our students. And so I really love that. And as admin, we're also doing the work, but I think we're trying to push each other to not only change what's happening at our school site, but use this momentum to then change the system of the district. And we watched a webinar with Bettina Love and a couple other Black leaders where they were indicating that we needed to change the questions on our hiring questionnaires. And that's perfect, right? Like, tell me how it is that you're anti-racist and how you're going to fit into our school setting versus tell me what you've done in 20 years, you know, with your career. No, let's get really specific on how you're going to help us bring up all students regardless of affluence, regardless of, you know, what their challenges may be. How are you going to serve our purpose as a whole? So I really love that.
And have specific activities like that, you know, the questions, and look at the answers. And remember that some people may know what they should say, you know, so you want to dig a little deeper, because some people have got sophisticated in their answers and they know what it should sound like, you know. And so you want to make sure when they are answering those questions that they give you a little bit of evidence as to how they have done this, you know. And also as they come into the school environment, they need to know how they're going to be supported, because it's not easy to do this work. There's one school I worked in where the interviewing team said, you know, we are going to share with our interviewees the fact that they will have a journeying partner. You know, like how you have a walking partner, somebody you go walking with, and when you come to our school, we will work together, we will walk together, we will be with you when you stumble, you know, and lift you up. And that was laid out. And if you don't want to come to a school like that, then maybe you shouldn't go through with the interview. But if you know that you have a lot to learn and you're able to, you know, take that support, that it can be done. So there are ways of doing this. And there are administrators who have the responsibility of modeling anti-racist behavior, you know, of mentoring around anti-racist behavior, of monitoring it too, you know, and of course of mandating it. But often we just use the mandate. But I want the other three. I want demonstration of what it should look like. I want support for people who need to do it. I want ongoing measures to say, is it being done? You know, and noted, because we know what is measured is what gets done, right? And so you can't have a whole set of things that are noteworthy and that's not included, you know? So I think those are ways to do it. And if there are conversations about racism that come up more frequently, because you're doing anti-racist work, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. In fact, it could be a good thing. You're cleaning the air. You're airing out the historic and ongoing unspoken wrongs that have been there. And as somebody said, you have human rights because they have been human wrongs, you know? So that's these things. I want to spend a little time on some slides that might answer some of these questions. Is that okay, Adora? Just
yes, go right ahead.
Folks have more.
I want to get back to Krista also had a comment. So while you're pulling up your slides, while you're pulling up your slides, I'm going to ask Krista to unmute and expand on her comment.
Okay.
So I'll just quickly try and capture. I think so many of our teachers really believe that they want what's best for these kids that are in their room. But historically, our systems that we've put in place have actually led to more isolation or disadvantaged students by moving them out of rooms into these small spaces. But teachers, with the best of intentions, still believe that that's how to get a kid help. I think that's just one example of a system, but really when I'm thinking about this achievement gap and those spaces where we're really overcoming belief systems of historical practices, and that we really hope against hope it's going to work this time, even though the evidence doesn't see that. And just where have you seen people be able to step back and reinvent that? Or what have been the keys to making those changes for students?
Let me say something quickly about the gap, which I think might be helpful. One of the slides I'm going to show you says, the gap is not in the person, it's in the system, right? And that actually is helpful because you know that systems keep recreating themselves. So you know you have to keep doing it, right? So trying to find that gap in those gaps in the system can help you. And there have been places where people have said, well, who benefits from the way we are doing this, you know? And so that's when it becomes clear that this is not working for a whole set of students. So reanalyzing where the gap really is. Because if we see the gap in the student, then we think in deficit terms of a human being. So we say, where is this gap in the system? And sometimes you can begin with just gaps that are that you experience in your system as a leader, as a teacher. And then that helps. And remember, like every system has to be worked on, worked with, shored up, refreshed every single year. In fact, I would say every single school term, right? Because that's how you keep it running. Okay. Let me just say a few things. I'm going to spend maybe about 10, just try to get this presentation up. Hope after all of this that it will, oh yes, okay, I think we're good with this. And then I will, yes, okay. Let me just do a few quick things which may speak to some of what you have in mind. And, oh, not the right view in terms of slideshow, good. Okay, are we there? Yeah. Can folks see this?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, all right. Just one of the reasons why I want to, why I started with this is just to show you how long this term has been in place, you know? I mean, many people talk about anti-racism as if it was just discovered, right? And as was pointed out, any concerted, intentional effort to undo the system of racism that's part and parcel of this country, of Canada, of all the places that, you know, actually have white dominance as their way of being, is anti-racist. It doesn't get called that all the time, but that is really what you're doing. You are changing this, trying to dismantle the status quo in terms of who's valued. And so that book, actually, I wrote it in 1985. It was sponsored, the work was sponsored by a community group that was engaging with questions of anti-racism. I used my conversations with teachers, like Marsha. Marsha is a teacher, but it's a composite of many teachers, and the questions that she asked about curriculum, things I saw, things with parents, things with assessment. I wrote it in letters, wrote them in letters to her, and then I wrote a letter that she would have responded to me. And I just bring that up to say that that's a format that's very disarming, right? You read it, right? You could read it, and I would think of the things that people would say to me and get at it. And it is one of, if it's not, I'm not sure this, but I think it's one of the earliest books in Canada that has the term anti-racist in the title. And not only was it sponsored by a community group, it was funded by the federal government of Canada. And I just say that is that there are times in a nation's history where parts of it want to address the deep and historic racism that's been visited on Indigenous people, on Black people, on people who are not white over the years. So that came out in 85. Okay. Was it not? Was it? What's going on here?
So Enid, we're going to take another question from our Facebook audience.
Okay, all right. So how do I have to get off? Stop sharing? No.
No, keep sharing. Okay. Mac will ask the question.
Yeah, please.
Okay, here's the question. The schools of education are bastions of white domination. They send teachers woefully unprepared for today's Black and brown students. Do you ever work with schools of education? If not, why not? And if so, how did that go?
Well, first of all, I have worked with schools of education and in Canada, in Toronto. Schools of education here, educational leadership in some places here in California, in Boston, with residency programs, yes. And how have they gone? Sometimes they have gone well, and sometimes they have gone poorly. And I say that a little bit flippantly. I would say portions of it have moved forward, right? Where instead of dealing with this on one day at the end of the year, when you're wrapping up, you see it embedded in the entire curriculum, right? In the entire curriculum that teachers have to go through, where the teachers get support with what they're doing so they're not left to flounder, right? Where they have learned where the environments into which they have gone have supported them, right? But it's like everything else that is systemic. The job is never finished. And that is the mistake we make sometimes, to think, well, after I've done this, why do we still have racism? We still have racism because racism is a system that's part and parcel of countries, of parts and parcel of institutions, historically, and they serve certain interests. However, within those institutions, those countries, you have people who are reaching for the goal of equality, at least on the books, right? And so we keep pushing in that direction. But I think if it's systemic, if it's applied, if it's supported, and if it's measured in terms of what is the result of it, I think it works. I think about a situation where people came for a professional development session, and I said to them, on the third day, when you come back here, I would like you to bring evidence from your students that you attended this session. You know, so people are released, and in that particular school, the kids called teachers going off on PD as grown-up school, is what they said. And it was the days when they would come for the whole day. So one fourth grade teacher brought back 24 letters from the students to me, letting me know what had taken place as a result of their teacher coming. And they had wonderful salutations like, "Dear Miss Equity, thank you for looking into that." I don't know if they thought that was my job or whatever, but they wrote me these letters. And then they went through things like, the teacher in our class allowed us to do the student-led conference in home language for the first time. You know, student-led conferences. So when my father came to the school for parent meeting for the student-led conference, and he heard Punjabi being spoken in the school, he wept because he felt as if for the first time the school was his, right? So that's a small example of someone redistributing institutional power, embracing language of home, including students. And as the kid said, he didn't even know what we were saying. So it's clear that he trusted us because he didn't know what we would say to our parents. He doesn't know Punjabi. But anyway, so people came with concrete things. And so I feel that it's successful when you have measures that are small and measures that are built up and continued. And of course, you might say, but are they doing it now? I don't know. But that's why it has to be a repeated, systemic approach, that you can't just do it and leave it and say, oh, that's over. Okay. Other questions? Are there other questions too? Are we moving on?
You know what, Enid, let's move on and talk about some of your earlier work.
Okay.
You also wrote some articles, and you told me a really good story the other day about how you went back to look at the articles that you wrote 35 years ago, and wanted to see what you talked about then.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about what you found out about then and about now? So
for instance, can folks see what's on the screen, like Anti-Racist Education 1986? So that article came out just after Letters to Marsha. A couple of things. When I read them, read this one, I thought, gee, I was much less nuanced than I am now. So I was much more direct with what I said. And that pushes me to directness now. So one of the things I've learned about the importance of looking back at your work, and at work when you perhaps don't count the cost as much as when you are older, is that it pushes you forward. Yeah. So for instance, this, so I said here, dealing with inequality and discrimination in the curriculum itself requires a critique of existing curricula. So that's something that we often don't want to do, because we want to add new pieces, like a few extra pieces to it. But you really have to tear apart what exists, and then you restructure it, right? I said that in that year because it's true. If you just add pieces to it, as opposed to opening it up and really seeing what's at the root of it, and really noticing that a whole lot of people's lives are missing, is that people are misrepresented, that they're silenced, right? Then you won't know where to fill it. And this is one of the things that reminded me of when we're talking about equity. You cannot talk about equity unless you talk about inequity. If you don't name the inequity, people will wonder, what are you talking about? And sometimes that's why people sit with glazed looks in workshops. You have to lay out this is lacking, this is missing, this is unfair, this is unjust, this is not meeting the standards. So I reminded myself when I looked at these articles. And then there was another one called Speaking Out on Racism. If you look over on this side, you will see I'm among 7 people. I'm the one in the middle with the old-fashioned phone there. All of those people did the same work I did in their districts, you know, from they were in Scarborough, they were in North York, they were in different parts of Toronto. And why I mention that is that there is a time when districts and so forth get behind this work. Those positions have since been removed. And, you know, it's, well, we just have to fold it into somebody else's job, right? And sometimes it doesn't get done because people have other things. So when I look back at things like those, it reminds me that unless you're intentional, unless you devote resources to it, unless you give people time to work on it, it can get lost. So all of those people, they were among my colleagues, and we would meet and we'd have the, you know, Association of Race Relations people, and we would share strategies and so forth. That doesn't happen across the district in the way it does now. So looking back has that value. Then there's another one, 94, called Anti-Racist Education, Panacea or Palliative. And so I took a critical view of what was being described as anti-racist at the time, because everybody was just using the word and attaching it to everything, right? As I think, I'm glad that the word is so prominent now in our world. I'm also urging us to look critically at what people are calling racist and anti-racist, right? And I would say if you overlook the question of dismantling power, redistributing power, putting decision-making opportunities in the hands of people who have not had it, looking at people's resistance to being mistreated, looking at people's, you know, determination that they will matter, then I would say it needs to be pushed and it can just be glossed over. So that's what that article reminded me of. And I just want one more, and this was one that I wrote, taking multicultural anti-racist education seriously. And the twist there was the seriously, right? Because once the word multicultural is in it, some people think that it's watered down and it's festival food and folklore, right? In fact, the term anti-racist was adopted in Canada in the mid-80s in educational work as in somewhat in opposition to the multicultural term, because multiculturalism was considered very soft and weak in some parts, and anti-racism dealt with power, you know, structures and so forth. And so I put both of them together, you know, and there would be people who wouldn't come to sessions if the word anti-racist was in it. So I put both. So you can come, yeah, there are ways. I'm going to talk about the same thing anyway, but if I need to remind you that multiculturalism can only work if racism is abolished, then I'll put it, but I'm going to talk about the same thing, right? So, and those are 4 interviews that were unearthed by my friend, Dr. Linda Mizell, in putting this together. And I was struck by the fact that they were interviews, right? And sometimes we dismiss something because it hasn't been written up for a formal journal. I can tell you that that article got published in Rethinking Our Classrooms because I had, I know, they had asked me to write it and I kept being too busy to write it. And they phoned me and said, okay, talk, we will transcribe everything you say. And I spoke for an hour and they transcribed it. And why I say that is that some important work is done, but because it's not, you know, presented as a formal paper or in some document, is disregarded. Somebody was saying to me the other day that a community group that had worked very vigorously to make change in a district was discarded because they hadn't written it down. And I said, tape it, transcribe it, and give it back to them and say, do you realize this is what you said? So there's just something about the interview format that we should take into account.
So
there is
Linda Mizell has put a statement in the chat, and I wish Linda would unmute herself and expand on this statement, because I think it's really, it's something that I struggle with in terms of the anti-racist work and how it comes and goes, and people in positions of power seem to erase it when it's convenient for them. But Linda, could you unmute and?
Yes. Enid, I seem to recall, and please correct me if I'm disremembering this, but I seem to recall you telling me years ago that that after a new conservative government came into place, that not only were those positions removed, but all the work that had been accumulated, all the the resources, the reports, the documents that all of you had accumulated, that they were removed and destroyed in an effort to erase the existence of that department.
Yes, yes, you're absolutely right, Linda. So the question was that it is, you said that it is, your observation was that this thing is not only, it is not only, what was the question that you had put forward, or the statement about erasure? As I'm agreeing with that, what did you say? What was
Linda said in her statement, I seem to recall Enid telling me that under conservative leadership,
yes,
not only were those positions removed, but the work they produced, reports, resources, etc., were removed and destroyed in an effort to erase it.
Yes, that's right. And so that's why you're right. It's not that we just didn't have those positions. The actual material, was removed. And also one of the things that got removed too was the data we gathered about hiring around race. That was part of the job I did, like who's working where and what were their racial backgrounds and where were they fit. And when I went back sometime later, that material was destroyed. Yes. So in a way, this is why I say expect racism, but do not accept it. And so every time we're able to note that something has been erased, right? I like us to change that passive voice from it has been erased onto who, to have a subject, who erased it, right? Because you see, when we say it's been erased, it describes a condition, right? But that condition exists because somebody took action. And so that which has been erased has to be restored and can be restored, and part of our job in doing anti-racist work is restoring what has been learned, found, and helped us to move forward. So I'm glad you say erasure, but expect erasure and replacement must happen. Replacement.
And one of the other lessons from that, Enid, is that we have to maintain our own archives.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, because even just there's material that comes out of Canada now that doesn't reflect what I'm showing you. It doesn't, because it's been erased or forgotten or wherever. But going onto the archives of the University of Toronto, I was able to find the entire set of things that were written about anti-racist education between 80 and 90. So yes, and that leads me to a quick slide that, there were a lot, but I'm going to move along because how much time do we?
We've got 10 minutes left.
10 minutes, all right. All right, I want to say something quickly and briskly about some of these slides. Beyond Heroes and Holidays, and again, that document came about through the work from Teaching for Change and the National Coalition of Education Activists, and those are my co-authors co-editors who more than 20 years ago, where we worked on that book. And what we wanted to accomplish was the following. We wanted teacher voice in the articles. So we had both practicing teachers and people who were researching in the universities to put those together. And in some ways, recreating what people studied was simply what we were trying to do, to say they studied us, but we actually did it. And we did that with that book in that period. And we have tried to update it and so forth, but it's a message that we need to have teacher voice, practitioner voice in that, because that's what Beyond Heroes and Holidays, and it's gone far and wide. People just jump in if there is something, but I want to say that.
So Enid, why did you write Beyond? I mean, what was the purpose of Beyond Heroes and Holidays?
The term comes from James Banks's work, where he has the levels of multicultural engagement, and he says, you know, you have heroes and holidays, you know, like the festivals and folklore, and we wanted to push beyond to say that anti-racism, the whole title is A Practical Guide to K-12 Anti-Racist Multicultural Education and Staff Development. And we wanted to push the question of power and redistribution of power and challenging structural racism in that work through teacher voice and also that of researchers. So that's why we wrote it. It also has some student work in it. It also has parent voice in it, okay? And it's updated accordingly, but that's why we did it. And it came out of...
We've got a few minutes left. And before we go though, I really want to address, want you to speak to anti-racism in our current context.
Okay, all right.
And so, how do we keep this movement going? I say using the word movement, but it's more than that. How do we keep the momentum? How do we keep it in the forefront?
All right. So
let me not let it slip away again.
Okay, clearly we have to meet again to talk about this in greater depth, but let me look at these set of slides, right? So that slide, COVID-19 has exposed the pre-existing conditions of racial inequality. I came up with that statement at the beginning of this moment we're in. All of the webinars that I've done since March, you know, because of distance teaching and learning, have been guided by that recognition. So one of the ways you keep it in mind is by looking around you of what actually is happening in our world, like how headlines tell us that we can't stop, that's one. And the second thing, in this COVID particularly teaches us that what is happening is not happening just because we've been struck with this pandemic. It's the state of things in terms of inequality around health, around job opportunities, around climate and all of climate change, crisis and all of those things, but medical matters, that is at the basis of its continuation. So two things, looking at what's happening and digging under what has led to it, you know, because the leading to it and the excavation of what is under it is what can help us to keep it going and let it not return. So that's one slide. The thing that keeps it moving for me is reminding ourselves that it's not an episode. Like it's like when people say that's a racist incident, I immediately think, what is that? How is that incident a manifestation of a system? You know, for instance, when you talk about particular actions by the police, for example, how does police culture, expectations, history give rise to that? And I don't mean that individual people are not responsible for their behavior, but what we have to get at is not just few bad apples or, you know, look at the soil that it's in, you know? So that helps me by what I mean by it's a system. I go back to my idea of systems and the cards that some of you may be familiar with, these checking my systems for equity. These cards are ones that help us look at systems within our classrooms and to ask how they are connected to larger systems and to figure out what we can do around them. And when we document the changes that we make from the cards, so the cards have 8 points which say, you know, what systems have you tried to change? What new actions will you undertake? And most important, question 6, what changes have you noted? Because that's how you push to the next system. Like if you want the district to be moved by your anti-racist actions, do things at your site, have results, and share them with the district, because there's nothing that convinces people as much as evidence to say, look, these children, I'm thinking of a particular school where the Latino kids were written off at the back from the beginning of the year that they were not going to do well in math, right? And the administrator restructured, he pulled them out and he restructured a class that had a support from special education and the math teacher. And by the end of the first term, the students were doing very well. And the math teacher had changed what he was doing, you know, in terms of, for example, giving them multiple times to try the activity, having them keep their own grade books. So they lost the fear of math, right? And that's what I mean, that he had a system. That teacher said in the presence of the staff, the system has failed these students in math up to now. And I have to change my system if I want the result to be different. And those are the kind of examples. Now, a teacher like that needs support. You can't expect him to spend the whole summer reviewing his curriculum with no support. But those examples of systemic change, even at the classroom level, are the things that I really encourage us to do. And this slide really hit it off with many. Turn the gap into a goal, right? So we have a gap. Now, how are we going to work towards not making it a gap? And remember, the gap is not in the person, it's in the system, because that immediately takes away the deficit language that we visit on students. History. Dr. Asa Hilliard, who has influenced my thinking more than perhaps anybody else around history, he says that specific attention to the history of deliberate group oppression has been given by a number of historians. Educators who are not familiar with the substance of these written histories cannot construct a holistic map of equity territory. And he's talking about legislation, about custom that segregates students, that underfunds them, that excludes their families from decision-making and so on. And that's just school. But remember, it's throughout the entire society of deliberate group oppression. Remember how we're hearing that just in terms of voting, a court said that the way voting was addressed in, I think, one of the Carolinas, I can't remember which, he said, the person said, the court said it was with precision that it was targeted to a particular group, right? So these things that are happening are not accidental. Like when we say things have changed back, things are lost, they're not just lost. Actions have been taken that have made them disappear. And part of your work as an anti-racist educator is to restore them and advance them. But knowing the history matters. That's why when I listen on Monday mornings about resistance, I always listen. Who else is doing this work? Who has done this before? So just to say that. This is what I want to talk about. Sorry?
So Enid, we've got a minute. So we're going to end on this slide. And
all right.
you, speak to the slide, and then I want to let people know and invite you to come back and continue the conversation. But first, I'm going to let you finish with this slide.
This is a good, even though there are many more slides, this is a good one to end on because it deals with the whole question of erasure. Do you notice who is writing in this picture, right? Remember, so this is Asa Hilliard talking about history as kind of like we know it more in school. This is a picture that says history is written by the winners. I want you to look at who is writing, right? All kinds of people, young people, people who are in clearly from different backgrounds, but they are documenting their practice, right? And this is a good note to end it on. Don't just say, we tried this. Let's document what we did and what has happened as a result of what we did so far, right? And that is part of the work. Because if you don't get any news about what changes, if you don't get any news about what happens when you address racism, it makes you unable to continue. And it doesn't have to be all wonderful news that everything is perfect. No, this is ongoing. And sometimes when people argue with you most vociferously, that is when you're making the point. And people have gone before us who are doing it. People are beside us working on it. And, you know, we're not going to be the last ones to address this, but let us not miss our chance in history to make this different. So
Enid,
yes.
Thank you so much for coming and having this conversation. And like I said, I would love to invite you to continue this conversation in a series so that we can go deeper into this work that you've been doing for the past 35 years. I'd also like to thank our audience and let them know that Enid is open to hearing from you. You have her website, and please feel free to contact her and continue to ask your questions. And Enid's also asked that you send her your notes so that she understands your understanding.
Yes.
And then the last thing I'd like to say before we sign off is look for our future series. We will be posting it on our social media accounts. And I also would like to encourage everyone that none of this change can happen unless we get political and you take the opportunity to vote. Please, please go and vote. Vote by mail, vote in person, vote early. This work must continue. And the only way it can continue is if your voice is heard. So once again, look for our series on Facebook and social media. Thank you again for attending.
Thank you for saying that about the voting. And just in case people think that you're being political, you are simply speaking about what we say we believe in, right? I mean, you're not introducing.
Right. I'm not worried about who you vote for. I'm just worried that you vote.
Okay. Right, good. So let's be intimidated by any talk. Let's remember what is at stake and that we have power in our respective systems and with each other to make it different. And we're going to write it down so it can be told and it will be harder to erase. Thank you.
Folks have asked if you can put the contact slide back up.
Put your contact slide up, Enid.
How do I do that now?
Just keep scrolling through.
Okay, that's probably the easiest.
That'll be the easiest.
Yes, okay, so here we are, contact slide. Oh my goodness. Oh, there were a lot of slides. Okay, our contact slide is, why can I not find it? Why?
It's also viewable on Facebook.
I think it was the last one, Enid, that you, okay.
So why can't I find it though? Oh, I know what it is. The pictures are in front of me. Oh yes, here we are, thank you. Yeah, okay, so does that help? Is that big enough?
We can't
have to click on it.
All right, there we go.
There you go. You
Can you
got
see?
it.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And so you can come to the site, you can write, you can whatever, but send the notes and you don't have to do a fair copy. I can read all kinds of handwriting, just photocopy the thing. And, and even if you have, comments about me, such as she talks a lot, she's long-winded, I won't take it personally. I would just regard it as valuable feedback. All feedback is valuable. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and we're going to end our live stream now.
Yeah. Oh, 5 minutes, so thank you. Do we leave or how does it work?
I think, yeah.
Do we leave or